Warm welcome, everyone, from the Minder de Gunzburg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. This is a webinar in our European Economic Policy Forum series, and it is intended to address an issue which has been a continuous sort of debate over decades, actually, namely whether the German model, and that's why we put it into inverted commas, whether the German model can adapt, survive. And the most recent challenge, a challenge which is following up on the COVID-19 crisis, might be game shifting. It is about how can small open economies, that is economies with a high share of exports in their GDP, economies which are export oriented, and Germany to some degree is a role model for it. Actually, it is the role model because though given its size, it has a very high export share. Small economies, of course, do have hires, but with some 47% of exports in GDP and about a quarter of its employment directly concerned by exports, it is of course now challenged in the new environment. And this is interesting for Europe in particular, because Europe is basically characterized by small open economies. Small in terms of not having much of an impact on their environment, open in terms of having a very substantial share of exports plus imports divided into GDP. And this model has been seen as quite successful, and it is characteristic in particular of Northern European economies. So this is now an environment where those economies might be threatened. And most clearly, the threat is coming from the Russian war in Ukraine, which emphasizes the dependence of these small open economies on trade and exchange. You go into a trade because it's mutually beneficial. If the trade is disrupted, or if trade is reoriented, then those economies will do have to adapt. We are lucky to have an excellent panel. We will be first hearing Dalia Marin, who is professor of economics at the Technical University of Munich and has been a most influential researcher on the reasons to understand why the German economy has been developing rather resiliently, rather robustly over the last 20 years in the face of a number of shocks. And she's been spearheading research on the importance of the global value chain into which German firms are integrated, and how deeply they are also integrated into the value chain in Eastern Europe. After Dalia's introductory remarks, we will have the opportunity to listen to Jérôme Créel. Jérôme is head of department at the French Institute, renowned French Institute, I should add, OFCE. He has worked on many issues concerning policy coordination within Europe, European public sector goods, recently on health issues, health as a European public sector good to be provided by the European Union. And then we will have a perspective of somebody who's been working on those issues also for 2 decades at a minimum, Dirk Schumacher, who is head of European macro research at Natixis. And he worked before at the ECB, European Central Bank, and prior to that for 17 years at Goldman Sachs as managing director. Unfortunately, we do not have on this webinar, on this panel, somebody who's been co-organizing actually the webinar, Sigmar Gabriel, who's also senior fellow at Center for European Studies. Sigmar gave me a call this morning. He's feverish, lying in bed, feeling really sick. We will have other opportunities to have him. My name is Hans-Helmut Kotz. I'm a resident fellow at the Center for European Studies, and I co-chair this series with Dante Roschini over from the business school. So without further ado, Dalia, we are so happy to have you here. So may I ask you to set us on track?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join this seminar. Okay, so I want to start with the question, what is the German economic model? The German economic model emerged after the fall of communism in 1989. With the fall of communism, trade was liberalized between Germany and Europe on the one hand, and Eastern Europe on the other. And this trade liberalization had three profound effects on the German economy. The first effect was decentralized wage bargaining. The second effect was a decentralized, less hierarchical management style in firms. And the third effect was the expansion of production networks to Eastern Europe. So I want to walk you through these three effects. So first, to decentralized wage bargaining. The opening up of Eastern Europe led to a loss of trade union power in Germany. The threat to move production to Eastern Europe changed the power equilibrium between trade unions and employers' federation. And as a result, the wage bargaining was decentralized from the national level to the firm level. And as a result, unit labor costs declined dramatically and Germany improved its competitiveness, the so-called Lohnzurückhaltung. Germany moved from a higher wage country to a lower wage country. And it is important to note that the Hartz reforms in 2002 played no role in this, since they were introduced a decade later. So when we look at relative unit labor costs, which are shown here for selected countries between 1994 to 2012, you see the bottom dark blue line is Germany. So relative unit labor cost in Germany declined until 2002 by 20%, and after 2002, after the Hartz reforms, by about another 10%. So let me come now to decentralized management. So with the opening up of Eastern Europe, firms introduced decentralized management. Decentralized management means that the top CEO at the top of the organization delegates power to lower levels of management. And the reason why firms did this is because with more trade, competition intensified, and with more competition, ideas become more important. So in order to encourage ideas from workers lower down in the firm hierarchy, firms decentralize decision-making power to lower levels of management. And this decentralized management led to a business culture of quality, because decentralized management provides incentives for product quality. Workers at lower levels of the firm hierarchy are better informed about market demands. And when you give power to those workers, this encourages the introduction of products that customers appreciate. So as a result, decentralized management increased the export market share of a typical firm by a factor of 3 in Germany, compared to a firm that did not introduce decentralized management. So let me show you here. This gives the export market share for several European countries. And when you look at Germany, the red bulb gives the export market share of the typical firm, the median firm, with decentralized management, and the blue bulk gives it without decentralized management. It's also important to note when you look at this figure that in France you don't see this. So maybe we can take this up in the discussion. So the third effect of opening up of Eastern Europe was that that firms expanded their production networks to Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was rich in skilled labor, so they offered a pool of skilled workers. And Germany in the 1990s went through a severe skill shortage. And as a result, Germany offshored the skill-intensive part of the supply chains to Eastern Europe. Here, this slide shows you the skill shortage in Germany. It shows the estimate that I myself have undertaken about the human capital stock in Germany. And what you see is that the human capital stock per person stopped to expand in the 1990s. From 1999 to 1997, it expanded by 0.18%, while in the 80s, it expanded by 0.75%. And it is important to note that in the 90s, we had the information technology revolution, which has put the pressure on the demand for skills. And during exactly this time, Germany stopped to expand its skill levels. At the same time, Eastern Europe was rich in skills. 16% of the population in Eastern Europe had academic degrees, compared to 15% of Germans. So when German firms invested in Eastern Europe, they employed 3 times as many people with academic degrees and 11% more research personnel in their subsidiaries in Eastern Europe compared to what they do in their parent firms in Germany. So as a result, Germany shows a super competitiveness. It got a helping hand from Eastern Europe because the production networks to Eastern Europe increased productivity in German multinational firms by over 20%. So, and this graph shows the export market share for the typical firm. In Germany, the red one is those firms that offshored, and the blue one is those firms that did not offshore. And so you see that those firms which offshoring did much better. So let me summarize what the German economic model is. It was driven by the opening up of markets to Eastern Europe. It led to lower wages via decentralized wage bargaining. It led to lower production costs via offshoring to Eastern Europe. And it led to excellent product quality via decentralized management. So Germany moved from the sick man of Europe in the 1990s to an economic powerhouse today. So the question that comes up now is, will this change with Putin's war? So in order to answer that question, I want to look at the experience of the financial crisis. So the era of hyperglobalization ended with the financial crisis. So global supply chains account for 60% of world trade before the financial crisis. But after the financial crisis, it has stopped, global supply chains have stopped to expand. And this can be seen by this figure that gives the evolution of global supply chains over time. And what you see is that from 2000 to 2008, global supply chains exploded because the opening up of Eastern Europe on the one hand and China's entry to the WTO on the other, these were 2 regions with low wages, so firms in rich countries offshored production to this region, and as a result, global supply chains exploded. You know, this period is called the period of hyperglobalization. But with the financial crisis, we had a collapse in these global supply chains. They recovered and overshoot, in fact, but since 2011, they are not expanding anymore. So the question is, why have global supply chains stopped to grow after the financial crisis? The financial crisis changed the relative cost of global supply chains and robots. On the one hand, we have an increase in uncertainty in the financial crisis, which made global supply chains more costly because there was the increased risk of a non-delivery of an input good. On the other, we had that the cost of financing a robot relative to hourly wages declined sharply because central banks tried to fight the crisis by lowering interest rates. So let me show you the increase in uncertainty after the financial crisis. And this is measured by the World Uncertainty Index. And when you look at this figure, you see from 2008 until 2012, until the European debt crisis, this index rose by 250%. At the same time, there was the decline in financing costs of robots. When you look here at Germany, the red line gives the lending rates relative to hourly wages. So what you see in the financial crisis, the lending rates relative to hourly wages dropped by more than 100%. This is the scaling on the left side. At the same time, robots per 1,000 workers, measuring the robot intensity of the German economy, expanded fast, slowed down in the financial crisis, and expanded fast after the financial crisis. So basically, the scaling is on the right side, and what you see is basically that the robot intensity of the German economy doubled during this period. So as a result, we have reshoring home. Firms in rich countries reshored production back to their home country and invested in robots instead. So after the financial crisis, global supply chains and robots became substitutes. Let me show you this. So this is a regression discontinuity plot. On the right side, you see the situation after the financial crisis. And you see a clear negative relationship between robots on the horizontal axis and global supply chains on the vertical axis. It means that the more robots a sector had, the less it engaged in global supply chains. And the reason for that is that when a sector has already a lot of, is sufficiently robotized, it means that the share of labor cost in total production cost is low, and therefore firms can reshore production back to the high-wage country, to Germany, and invest in robots instead. Now, COVID accelerated this trend and leads to globalization. While the financial crisis led to the end of hyperglobalization, COVID now leads to deglobalization. So we use the model to see that, and we get that the COVID uncertainty shock, the COVID is an enormous uncertainty shock, which is similar to the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, that lowers global supply chains by 35% and increases robot adoption by 76%. Now, Putin's war accelerates this deglobalization. Autocrats surrounded by yes men as Putin are not reliable business partners. So firms reassess their business model by investing in countries with autocrats. So the war shock comes on top of the COVID shock. And it is important to note that the duration of such supply chain disruption matters. So the fact that we had a COVID shock and the COVID supply chain disruption, and now a war supply chain disruption really makes firms to reassess their business model. So basically the war will lead to friendshoring on top of reshoring and nearshoring. And we actually have already a first evidence on this from an IFO survey on China that was undertaken in March 2022, in which 50% of German companies with supply chains in China, are planning to reduce their dependency on China in response to the war in Ukraine. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Dalia. It was a very interesting analysis and take on the issue. And I just highlight the 3 points just to repeat. You stressed the fact that the responsiveness of German wages in terms of managing, handling unit labor cost has been crucial in terms of supporting the competitiveness of German firms. Then you also stressed the fact that this was combined with a difference in terms of management styles, more use of local information by decentralization of management. And thirdly, the skills of Eastern Europeans, in particular in math and technical and engineering capacities, were usefully deployed, used in the German value chain, and which led to this phenomenon that the sick man of Europe, by the way, Germany has been declared numerous times the sick man of Europe. Whenever we had issues with the current account, not that often, but so the sick man of Europe turned out to become, as you call it, the powerhouse. Jerome, may I bring in you here? In France, you have seen much less of offshoring. The French don't like that. They call it Deglobalization. But the French also made a strong point, and others. So it's not about nationalism here. It's many Germans, some Germans also, by the way, who hold that the German current account surplus, which is the mirror image of this unit labor cost softness, if you like, was untenable, and that led Europeans to develop in the late 2010s, the late 2000s, a concept which is called macroeconomic imbalance procedure. And Germans were ferociously fighting for an asymmetric criterion, namely, we should be allowed at a maximum 6% of current account surplus. Turns out we had most of the time more, the Dutch even more. So how does this German philosophy match with European requirements, in particular going forward?
Thank you, Hans Helmut, for your question. In fact, during the preparation of this webinar, you told me that you would be asking why the French politicians and economists were criticizing the German current account surplus for such a long time. And
I wanted to rephrase it.
But I wanted to start with that and say that I have a very easy answer. Why have French politicians and economists in France been criticizing Germany? That's easy, because they were jealous for not being the first mover. It's just the answer, but I'm just half kidding, because in this discussion we do have upon the current account surplus in Germany, this idea of super competitiveness. I think that the fact of being the first mover is key, and countries outside Germany would certainly have loved being the first mover instead, not only France. But this creates an issue because we are part of the monetary union. And at the very moment the Germany has decided upon having a new surge of structural reforms in the 2000s to no longer be this so-called sick man of Europe, it of course created tensions with the French partners and the non-German partners within the euro area. The reason is that at this very moment, and maybe Dalia didn't mention that, in the 2000s, Germany switched from being a net importer to being a net exporter. And at this moment, I remember having worked on that with Jacques Lecacheux at OFC. It was in 2006. We did argue that the structural reforms in Germany were not driven towards improved efficiency inside Germany, but rather, as Dalia has documented a few minutes ago, it was meant to improve efficiency of German companies, but outside the borders of Germany. And the cost of these structural reforms was initially quite high in Germany for the German consumers because of sluggishness in wage inflation, but also costly for internal investors, for they had low internal demand and no reasons to invest so much in Germany. But then the cost has been for the competitors. But in a highly integrated area like the Euro area, your competitors are your neighbors. And what Germany wins, the others in the Euro area did lose. So the German Renaissance was, my view, initially a zero-sum game, but worst, it has weakened some of the partners of Germany inside the Euro area. For in order to cope with this super competitiveness by Germany with this lower wage country that Germany had been, a country like France, countries like Italy and Spain, they had to reduce their markups, for instance, to try to cope with lower competitiveness, and they limited their investments. So it has been costly, and at the moment we were hit by the global financial crisis, this revealed weakness of the EU has started jeopardizing the Euro area as such, and the reason why we have had to recourse to this so-called macro imbalance procedure and set some rules in order to not only limit our public deficits and debts that were controlled to some extent by the Stability and Growth Pact, but also our real divergences. Because this surge of growth in Germany, thanks to the structural reforms in Germany, has paved the way for further real convergence between the so-called north of Europe and the so-called south of Europe. And the south, because it were in the monetary union, could no longer rely on the nominal devaluation of the currency to try to catch up with the north. So there have been tension. Yet, some may argue that rather than criticizing the German model of export-led growth, or rather than criticizing Germany for implementing structural reforms, generating more efficiency in offshoring, one may say that the rest of Europe should have been doing the same. Yes, certainly, but part of the German model was also based on tax competition and on disinflation policies. And these policies, tax competition and disinflation policy, they work provided at least one condition is being met. The condition is that nobody else does the same at the same moment. And in my opinion, Germany did what its policymaker thought was best for Germany. And I think it's good, but it was provided the others in the Euro area would not be doing the same. And Germany won. German partners did not embark in the same policy at the same moment. That was the German Renaissance. But there have been costs with this non-cooperative strategy. And these costs have been large even for Germany. Germany has become a net exporter country, therefore a very large creditor country that now faces financial risk. Financial solidarity towards the laggards has been needed after the global financial crisis and during the European sovereign debt crisis. The Euro area which is a rich and very large market for goods and services, has been about to collapse. And there has been a lack of investment for at least a decade inside our borders, including maybe a lack of investment in, let's say, liquid natural gas terminals in Germany. Okay? And here we are, after a pandemic and now after the invasion of Ukraine, the financial rooms for maneuver are limited, and the external trade openness via the global value chains has shown a limit, which is the high dependence on imported inputs and raw materials. So you were asking me, Hans Helmut, whether German surpluses might have been creating tensions in the euro area, and I think they did, for all these reasons. Unfortunately, the macro imbalance procedure has not worked, but it is not a constraining device. Every year since its inception, Germany has a trade surplus, which is above the threshold of the 6% of GDP you were mentioning. Every year. What does the Commission do? It recommends Germany to reduce its surplus. Well said, but there are no actions behind. For, of course, it's not the authority of the German government to shift the trade surplus. It's a decision by firms in a free market economy. And besides that, there are no financial sanctions that would incentivize maybe Germany, maybe other countries like the Netherlands, to reduce to some extent their trade surpluses when they do have some. There are some financial sanctions within the Stability and Growth Pact. I must recall, no one has ever faced the financial sanctions despite limits have not been abided by, but they do exist, so they may incentivize a good behavior in terms of public finances when there are some fiscal rooms for maneuver to deal with that. But as for the macro imbalance procedure, there are no sanctions. There are only recommendations by the Commission. So this European tool has not worked so far. Maybe I should be ending here for this.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Jerome. You spoke of the assessment of super competitiveness. There's an argument by Wendy Carlin of ULC, who argues that this super competitiveness is the upshot of German labor unions taking account of the consequences of their trade of their wage negotiations on the competitiveness of their firm. That's very closely related to Dalia's point. And so Wendy goes on and says, you should be careful if you are in a monetary union with an economy which is behaving that way. And I mean, at the decentralized level, the counter argument could be, and that leads over to Dirk. While of course the German government does not, luckily, decide on wages at firm level, and that's what you stressed, Jerome. We now have infrastructure issues here, bridges falling apart, so disinvestment for 20 years probably. So one way to go about it might be, for example, to increase expenditures in the public sector capital stock. Dirk, I also asked you, I have to be honest, but only 2 or 3 hours
to be
ago,
honest, at all times.
To give you a couple of questions so that you could somehow, though you don't need any preparation, but anyhow, for the foreseeable future, we will have trouble in terms of access and prices of fuels. How does that impact our economy. There's been very traumatic assessments coming from chemical pharmaceutical industries, for example.
Yeah.
How do you assess that?
I mean, this is the debate about the Russian energy embargo and whether we should cut off any imports from Russia. And here, how damaging that is, I think, is a question of the degree and the speed and all that. So the German government has moved quite a bit on the question of oil embargo, for example. Only a couple of weeks ago, they said it would take until the end of the year to get rid of Russian oil imports. And now they said we're essentially ready to do that. They acknowledge it would still be painful, but it's not the end of the world. I think when it comes to gas, there the difference is that the subsidiability is in certain areas, to my understanding, very difficult. Now, I'm not an engineer. I have to trust to some extent what I read from engineers here, how difficult it is for a certain chemical plant who needs gas as for production to replace it. And I can see that it's difficult. And if you just take the 6 most gas intensive sector, you take an input output table, look at who needs what, and you assume in the short run the subsidiability is close to 0, and you shut off gas imports, and the reserves currently are around 1/3, but it still would imply a hit of a couple of percentage points to German GDP would be my best guess, taking into account some knock-on effects. There's a high degree of uncertainty and what is the right model to choose. And there was a big debate, at least in Germany, triggered by a first estimate from a couple of German professors using a trade model, but that model does not really take into account the adjustment path and so on and so forth. And further models have been done. There's a huge uncertainty. The one thing I would stress, though, it's astonishingly how little damage the huge energy shock we've seen over the last 6 months actually has done. If you look at the rise in the gas price, the quadrupling, if you look at the rise in the oil prices and all that, the economy was still growing at the beginning of the year. If you look at the latest business survey data, I would have thought by now, energy price shock, Russian war, that they would collapse. We do see consumer confidence collapse, but not business sentiment. It is still based on past correlation, consistent with continuing growth, which I don't think will happen in the second quarter. I do believe the German economy will contract in the second quarter, but the data so far don't back that up, which I find amazing, which tells me that in terms of the energy intensity, in terms of the dependence on energy, well, a lot has changed over the last 20, 30 years. So any regression, any model you estimate based on these data will to some extent give you a wrong picture, because the structural change on that front is very sharp. So coming back to your question, yes, this is a huge challenge to get rid of the Russian energy imports and the greening of the economy, the decarbonization. And I think actually the real obstacle or hurdle will be the lack of labor, the lack of people who can make that happen. I don't think funding is an issue. There's so much private capital willing to invest in all that area. It's really finding the workers who can put the solar panels on the roofs and well, building the windmills and all that. And of course, there's the bureaucratic aspect. Germany is not well known for making public investment run smoothly or implementing it. Coming back to the question, why hasn't it invested more in public? It's more like it's so damn difficult, excuse the language, to get the thing done. And there are so numerous examples in the airport in Berlin is just the most outrageous example of the inability to cope with these bureaucratic problems. And the new government said, we'll change that. And I'd love to see that, but we'll see. So there are many micro reasons why that has not gone the way it should have gone. I'm relatively hopeful some things will change, and the war, if you will, turbocharge the need for that transition and will probably push away some of these political bureaucratic hurdles. And yeah, and Germany will actually import less capital because it will need to invest heavily. And again, the numbers here, there's a big uncertainty, but you can easily end up with 50-100 billion per year over the next 10 years, private and public investments to get the green transition to reach the carbon targets and all that.
You were referring to that debate about what the short-term impact of complete decoupling would imply, and numbers have been between, if I recall it correctly, there was a shouting game, by the way.
Yeah.
Between 2.5 and 7 or so. But the point you made about substitutability between some of those input factors will, of course, be, that's at least what engineers are telling us, devastating for some industries. They could be devastating for some firms for some reasons, hysteresis, so they could be long lasting. The response of German policymakers to that has been to throw money at it, fiscal cushioning, which is not available to that degree in other countries. I just today learned from Italy, this is hitting badly many, in particular in the lower income households. But let me go over to a more medium run question, namely, if we will see import substitution, strategic autonomy, doesn't that put a really big question mark behind the export-driven economies of Northern Europe, so highly dependent on multilateralism, liberal trade environment? What are perspectives there? You touched on that, by the way. I'm now making a commercial for your recent podcast with Klaus Adam. You touched upon that in terms of thinking the consequences of deglobalization for these economies, or these type of economies.
Yeah, as Dalia said, I mean, if you look at the numbers, the stagnation in global trade that's visible since the financial crisis. And there are, by the way, also economic reasons that the underlying economic argument for expanding global value change gets weaker the longer it takes, and the more some of the emerging markets move up the value-added chain, and so on and so forth, on top of the political uncertainty that has increased over the last 10 years, if you will. But yeah, it's true that trade will be less of a boost for those countries, and they will have to reinvent themselves, or part of that. At the same time, how much deglobalization do we get? Just a very basic statistic here. The number of containers turned over in the biggest 90 harbors globally actually continues to grow at the same trend that we've seen. There was a big drop during the pandemic, and now it overshot the number of trends, and the lockdown measures in Shanghai will make that number go down again. But just looking at some of these high frequency data, we talk a lot about deglobalization, but we don't see it in all the data. So yeah, some rebalancing will be needed, and if you will, the Chinese economy is also an economy that needs a lot of rebalancing. In that case, more consumption and less investment. But the strategy probably will be one of diversification here. So yes, less reliance on China, Russia, and others. There's a reason why German Chancellor Scholz, his first visit to Asia was in Japan, to make the point there are other big economies there where you can make where business can be done. And of course, China is such a huge market, you cannot neglect it. And if you tell me, actually, next year we're going to stop all trade with China, yeah, then the future is really bleak. But if it's a gradual development panned out over the next 10 years, I think there's room to cope for it. But yeah, it's yet another adjustment that needs to happen, and it's not going to be pain-free, but it's at the same time not the first adjustment the economy is going through. And unification, obviously, was one of these big shocks. And if you look at supply side shocks, how the economy responds, and it's not always straightforward to define what a supply side shock is, but we have technical models where we can identify supply side shocks, so-called with sign restrictions in VR models. Well, yeah, the way the economy responds hasn't changed that much over the last year. So it's constantly hit by these changes, and technologies, obviously one of those changes that constantly challenges corporates to deal with. Take it the German car sector and electromobility and the whole diesel scandal. I would have thought 5 years ago, oh, that is it. That will kill the sector, because it took too long. It bet too long on diesel and combustion engine, but it managed quite well. There's certainly a lot of problems still, but I'm surprised again and again by the relative flexibility, and I guess that has something to do with the decentralized management style and so on and so forth. And by the way, if you have an economy which is globalized and open, then you also have, per definition, companies who have constantly deal with challenges, because that makes you stronger, if you will, or well, to put it a bit bluntly, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That probably counts as well for corporates to some extent. And by the way, Italy is also a very globalized economy in the sense it has a huge manufacturing sector, it runs a current account surplus. In that respect, France is a bit the outlier here. If you look at the export performance of France, it's staggering why it is the way it is. Also, not just compared to Germany, but to Italy, to Spain, to others, it has not reaped at all the potential benefits of globalization. So there's really a German story, but also a French story.
Dalia, I know Dirk for such a long time that I invite him because I know first he's a voice of reason, and secondly, he will be optimistic. No matter what, he will be optimistic. Do you share his optimism?
I'm actually concerning the energy boycott. I'm more optimistic than Dirk is, because
I know, I read it.
The reason why we might not see such a drastic drawback for the German economy, as you just mentioned, has exactly something to do with the fact that these forecasts by these 9 German economists, which use a model that takes into account the supply chains, the subtlety of supply chains. So the reason why they get not such a big drop in GDP for Germany by a boycott of gas, we are not talking about the other energy sources because they can be purchased globally, but the boycott for gas is exactly because even if the elasticity of substitution is near zero, in a big economy, there are lots of suppliers. You always can find some way or another a substitute. And the only thing you have to take into account is this O-ring feature of supply chains, in which if one chain collapses, then the whole chain collapses. So, but they take these, so they are realistic in many ways, much more realistic than the other forecasts that you have mentioned. So in that sense, I trust this forecast much more. So in that sense, I'm more optimistic. So their forecast is a GDP decline between 0.5% and 2.5%. It depends, because there is a lot of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Other
Yes.
institutes in Germany, if I may, consider the shock would be higher after an embargo in Germany. I think Barclays was mentioning 5% of a GDP drop. I think the forecast institutes were closer to 6.5%. So that might be a larger shock than expected by the 9 economists, one in France at Sciences Po, Maurice Soularic, who have performed the first forecast. So I would not be too much optimistic about the use of this forecast. But by the way, I'm always puzzled by the benchmark that all economists that we are having to use, for we comparing an unexpected shock like a war and the requirement for an embargo on the gas from Russia to a business as usual. But the business as usual, maybe it's behind us, and maybe we will never get there, or it will take a decade to get back to here. So maybe I've seen all the disputes among the German economists about this forecast of the cost of the embargo, but maybe the benchmark is what if we do nothing to stop the war? because it's what if we stop the war with the embargo? What would happen if we do nothing to stop as soon as possible this war and the possible expansion of this war to other territories than Ukraine? So I'm much more pessimistic than you may have been so far about what's going on in Europe today.
Yeah, so I trust more the economic models that involve people the research. I trust the research of Moritz Schulerich. I'm not so sure that I trust the forecast by any of, actually one of the economic research institute, the IFO Institute, was part of these nine economists. So anyway, but this is a debate that will lead us a little bit further. But I wanted to make a comment to you, Jerome, about the German model. You know, the problem is not the export-led growth model of Germany. That's not the problem. The problem is not too much exports is the problem, but too little imports is the problem. And the too little imports comes because Germany invests too little. It invests too little publicly and invests too little privately. And so Germany has a very low investment rate, private and public. You know, because when I look at the data, I'm actually seeing when after the financial crisis, wages in Germany started to rise much more than in other European countries. But Germany was still the star of the export performer. You know, I mean, the exports shooted up, and part of the story is China, because Germany could export after the financial crisis. Germany's export to China increased threefold. So, and that is a sign that this is product quality, because when wages rise, you still expand. So therefore, the problem is not, you don't want to kill Germany's exports. It's a good sign. You don't want to kill a successor. But what the problem is that we had very little imports. And the imports are driven by investment and consumption, and both were very low. So Germany did not contribute to demand in Europe. That was the problem, by public investment. So that is something that the government could have done, and it didn't do.
And I think we do agree on that, Dalia. And what I was mentioning was the net exports that were very high in Germany, and not the level of exports that was high. High exports is certainly good, but as we agree, having also a demand for import coming from large investment is certainly good for the future. And this is part also of this reshoring that you've been exposing about robots and these kinds of things. So I do agree that there has been a lack of investment in Germany, and I do see in the European Commission's agenda since 2019, just before COVID erupted, a good sign of making Europe maybe more resilient collectively to the shocks that will occur. So they occurred maybe too fast, COVID 2020, invasion of Ukraine 2022. But I think that the agenda goes in the good direction when we do have this CHIPS Act, the Next Generation EU with the Recovery and Resilience Facility that gives funding for investment, public, but also private, within the borders of the European Union and the Euro area, which I think will go in the good direction to make us effectively more resilient. So we need investment. I think in Germany, there have been years that there were also discussions on that. We also need in France, the level of net investment in France is close to zero if it's not negative. Okay, Italy has been having the same issue. France and Italy do not have the same public finances as Germany. We are facing many more difficulties. We have lower smaller fiscal margins for maneuver, but we have large needs, and maybe this European impetus goes in the good direction to leave export-led countries continue, but reducing a bit their net exports.
I think
my view. Sorry.
I'm sorry. It's actually interesting. I'm not so pessimistic about the future in Germany, actually. In spite of the fact that Germany is very much dependent on trade, and when you predict now that we will have deglobalization, it will be terrible for Germany. I don't think so. For instance, the idea, there was the debate because of the pandemic about supply chains, and so there were initiatives at the public level in the European Union as well as in the US to invest to increase resilience. And that made a lot of sense because, for instance, in the semiconductor industry, the input supply are completely concentrated in Asia, in South Korea, actually. And so the whole world economy, the auto sector was standing still because the factory was closed. Now there is an investment going on. It is very interesting, and that favors East Germany. East Germany is becoming a boom town. After 30 years of deindustrialization, now all these Intel and Bosch and Kettle and all the car firms all invest in East Germany into battery cells and in chips. So I think that if a big region in Germany that has been doing nothing basically starts to flourish, I don't think it's going to be that bad for Germany. I don't think there will be less growth. I'm pretty sure, because globalization was a big driver of growth. But we will have more security, and that will, and so this will cost us a bit of growth, but at the same time, maybe a more balanced way of growing.
This is a very good webinar. You basically don't have need for a moderator.
Please.
So you're substituting against me, which is nice. I would have nonetheless two questions. The first is closely related to what Jerome and Dalia were just talking about: resilience or strategic autonomy, or to use a very bad word, industrial policy. Many of the initiatives which Jerome mentioned are actually mirroring what the US administration had been coming forth with about a year before. That hadn't only to do with COVID and pharmaceuticals. It was about critical minerals, critical materials. It was about battery capacity. It was about, Dalia mentioned it, semiconductor manufacturing and so forth. Does Europe, or those export-dependent economies rely on this sort of initiatives going forward? Or can they just stay on the receiving end, whatever happens in China or the US? Do we need?
So you meant, should we have those government initiatives to?
Yep.
Well, the problem is we're obviously operating in the world economy. One big player, i.e. China, well, others too, have used government subsidies as means for industrial policy. Take the example of the German solar panel industry, which at some point was very big, also in East Germany, and it was competed out of the market by Chinese competitors because wages are lower in China, but also because there was a lot of implicit and explicit subsidy. So subsidies should be taken, done carefully, but the first best solution is probably not have them, but the second best is if some big player uses them aggressively, well, you have to reconsider what's the optimal response in that kind of case. And the same with being autonomous. I mean, it's like buying an insurance premium. It's a waste of money if the house is not set on fire, if you will. It would be better if you would be operating in a global economy where indeed stuff is produced where it makes the most sense to produce it, but we cannot necessarily rely that these trade patterns will hold. So we have to purchase an insurance and pay in premium for that, which is a waste of money if indeed the insurance case never materializes, but we can bang on that, and we have to recalibrate the probability or the likelihood of the house being on fire, so to speak. But it needs to be calibrated. I mean, subsidies and autonomy at all costs makes also no sense. What's the right price for that insurance premium in terms of taxpayers' money paid for subsidy? That's a hard one, a difficult one to answer.
Actually, Dirk, to be very transparent, I was just reading the headlines of the building resilient supply chains, revitalizing American manufacturing and fostering broad-based growth. 100 days review, executive order 14017, June 2021 of the Biden administration. And it continues with that. So it's not only bad China.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
There might be very good reasons for doing what the Biden administration is suggesting to do. And when I picked up our local newspaper today, on the second page of the economic section, you had an article on the econ minister who was for a very active economic policy. And on the just beside that article, there was one citing the finance minister being for order liberal, staying away policy. And my question was basically, how should Europe respond to that? Should we stay on the sidelines? Should we let things go? What should we do? Dalia.
I have a clear answer to this. I think first, the international economic, the forces for comparative advantage and the international economic order, all the benefits of globalization are still there, and there will always be these benefits, and we always want to go for them. At the same time, we are in a different situation today, and I think we have a competition that takes place, a technology competition. It's different than price competition, it's technology competition. So the Chinese invested tremendously in artificial intelligence, and we know that the future car will have a lot of artificial intelligence in it. Actually, the flying car or the self-driving car. So the car of the future will be something driven by artificial intelligence. Now, the artificial intelligence, the more data you produce, the more learning takes place, the better is the algorithm. So if you subsidize, like China does, you encourage learning, you produce more data, your algorithm becomes better. That is really directly increasing your competitive advantage. So this is something where you do want the government to get involved in, because we can lose the race for in artificial intelligence, and the car sector in Germany is extremely important. It accounts for a big chunk of the German economy. So you don't want the car industry to migrate to China. So I think there is here a case for industrial policy. So the initiative in Europe to introduce a battery cell sector in Europe makes a lot of sense, because the battery cell is an important part of the car. So car specialists say those people who understand the battery cell understand how an electric car works. So it's important to have the knowledge of battery cells here in Europe, because Europe is a big producer, a car producer. So yes, so I think we should take a more intelligent view on industrial policy and get away with the ideological components that many people put on industrial policy. In Germany, this was debated under, it was said that Germany is going back to central planning when Mr. Altmaier, the economy minister, introduced his industrial policy program. And this was, I think, in 2019. So I'm very much in favor of it. I'm not for autarky at all. Germany benefited enormously from an open economy, and it should go on with this. But at the same time, I think the world has changed and the technology has changed with a lot of learning. And when you have a lot of learning, there is a market failure. So you want the government to get involved. So yes.
Jerome,
if I may just add.
Jerome, I'll interrupt you because I want to build a bridge to you, which goes like this. When you have an industrial policy, which is done at national level, doesn't that imply the zero-sum argument which you raised a few minutes ago? Most of my French economist friends who are getting ever more nervous about the European Monetary Union highlight the fact that manufacturing industry, and in particular car making in France, is on a downward trajectory. And their argument is manufacturing is moving north. So industrial policy, how does one get the European dimension into that?
If I may, and I'm not a specialist in industrial policy, but my argument would be that it will be key to the strength of the European Union to have economies within that are able to strive and to have larger GDP, be able at the same moment to move to a green transition. And my view is that we must cooperate so that the very idea of an industrial policy at the national level within the European Union makes no sense. If we believe in an industrial policy, I guess we must believe in a European industrial policy. And I think we've seen some tries in the automobile industry to have shared knowledge, shared factory on battery cells between the French car industry, which is certainly not moving up fast enough, and the German car industry, which is a leader in its field. So this has started, but between two countries. I think it would be nice to have some kind of a planner, but used not in the Soviet style, but a planner at the European level to make sure that we go all in the good direction, that we do not compete too much one with another at a moment we face large competitors outside of Europe. In fact, my view of the Euro area integration process was that we would be having more trade within the Euro area. But what we saw since the creation of the Euro has been countries from the north of Europe increasing their external trade outside of the Euro area. I think what would be good for the Euro area as a whole is to redirect our trade within, provided we find the parts that we need to produce and we find also the market to sell. So easy to say, less easy to do, but I think cooperation is key in a world in which we've understood that they are opponents to us. It might be emerging nations, it might be Russia struggling against our solidarity, against our peace. So I think we need to share a project and to cooperate. And one last thought about subsidies is also that after COVID, we've certainly collectively understood that governments can be helpful. So we turn from a situation in which many did argue that any policy action from governments went in the bad direction and would, in macro terms, produce some crowding out effect. The investment by the public sector would be at the expense of the private sector, but no one does believe in that after COVID. Thanks to our governments, we've seen the situation recover as fast as possible. And when Dirk was mentioning that we've seen a sharp rise in energy, and in spite of that, we've seen a recovery, of course, it was also because governments have been intervening. And we were coming from a recession, which makes the recovery ever more likely. But I'm certain that the people do understand that governments are key in the functioning of the economy. I think our mindset has changed after COVID.
Thank you very much, Jerome. I do have a number of questions, and I've brought in all my fault, bring them in very late, and we are for sure overrunning, hopefully not too much. But I'd like to bring in two which are somehow condensing what our audience is thinking of. So the first is Pavel Dobzhansky. He asks whether the German economy is not already adapting in terms of labor costs increasing, inflation being very high social security spending. So do we see some endogenous response in terms of getting to a new equilibrium? So are we allowed to extrapolate? The second question comes from Frank Altemöller. He wonders whether a reorganization of the multilateral trading system could address those issues. So a world without Russia and or without China. Dalia, may I ask you to chip in?
Yes, I agree that the German economy is already adapting because wage increases, this is already taking place since the financial crisis, that there is no wage restraint anymore, and it will continue as we hear about the wage negotiations going on. So yes, I believe that there is already some adjustments going on, and it's quite surprising that even with the energy boycotts, in a couple of weeks, the economic minister said that we can get rid of all Russian oil, while 3 weeks ago he said this is impossible. So, people become inventive of how to adjust. What was the second question?
The second question was trade without China and Russia. Trading system.
I don't believe that we should exclude China out of it, except if China takes a strict move and supports Russia in the war. But as long as China is not doing this, I think we should not. If Germany cannot afford this. China has become such an important trading partner for Germany. So what I believe Germany needs to do now is really diversification. So it should not depend on China as much as it does now. So it should diversify, but it should not exclude China as a trading partner whatsoever. That I don't believe this is, I don't trust China, but I don't believe that we should. So you don't trust. So if you don't trust, you diversify, you have alternatives, but you don't close down all trading relationships with China whatsoever. I'm not for it, except if China starts to take position, which I think they are not going to do because they are smart. Yes.
Jerome, trade means mutually beneficial exchange.
Supposedly, yes.
To both. So if you reduce the level of trade, that would very simplistically mean you reduce welfare. Is it legitimate to trade with anybody and everybody?
So it starts being too philosophical and too late for me to reply to such questions. So I don't think I've ever mentioned a reduction in trade, but a rebalancing in trade between European countries for the sake of the EU would be good, in my view, for the European Union as a trade partner with the US, but also with China. And I think it would make us on an equal foot to discuss and agree on trade with the Chinese. And I would agree with Dalia that it's important to consider and continue having multilateral trade system with China, except if some political decisions are being taken geopolitically that go in the wrong direction. So I'm not against trade. Of course not.
Jerome, it was not philosophy. It was not philosophy. It was a question raised with regard to a major German company which is engaged in China, took a political view with regard to a region in China where human rights are not respected, and was put on spot by the Chinese government. As an upshot, sales went down dramatically. So firms are really exposed to that, CEOs in many domains. And I was just wondering, what should a poor CEO do there and then? And I was wondering also because of this nasty issue of rare earth. We do not sit on rare earth anywhere in Europe, basically. So we somehow depend.
So the Ukraine war is part of this, of rare earth, because Ukraine has a lot of sources in rare earth, and in particular in the East Donbass region. So I think part of the war is about this, because the future of electric cars will depend not on oil, but on this.
And sorry for going to philosophy or moralizing or ethics. We'll stop immediately. I was wondering whether Dirk could wrap up our debate in terms of how should fiscal policy and monetary policy respond to this in the short and medium run in a minute.
That's no problem. Can I just quickly mention one example of deglobalization, which is very close to our shores, which is UK and Brexit. I mean, looking at the trade data, I find it fascinating how low they are still, that they have not rebounded. Of course, we have an agreement, but if you want to look at the kind of miniature development going forward, studying Brexit, what it does to the bilateral trade relationship is very interesting, given the lack of dynamics to rebound there. But what should fiscal and monetary policy do? I mean, I'm all for, and this may not sound very German, using fiscal policy aggressively during times of crisis, and I guess we've done that. And
you must be working with a French bank.
Yeah, could be one explanation for it. No, but I do think I would address the problem of the German current account surplus via the kind of excessive consolidation efforts in the past. So I think fiscal policy has a role to play. I think those countries who can afford it should use fiscal policy aggressively, and those who can't, and there's some of them in Europe as well, should consolidate over the medium term. And frankly, the one country which has never managed really to consolidate is not Italy or Greece or Spain, but France, which has run constantly deficits for very long, cyclically adjusted deficits. So even during the good times, there wasn't really good time to adjust. But Germany has done the opposite in a way. So what I'm trying to say here is fiscal policy, yeah, we need better rules. Do I have a good template, what they should look like? No, certainly I can't tell you in a minute. monetary policy is in a rough time. There's no doubt. We're dealing with a stagflationary shock. There is no good answer. It all boils down to, will this initial big price shock lead to a lasting increase? And then we're back to how will wages develop? What will inflation expectations do? If the ECB thinks, and the evidence is mounting, that this is indeed developing the kind of self-reinforcing dynamics, well, then it needs to act. In fact, from a purely theoretical point of view, you could argue any supply side shock is what would trigger a response from the ECB, i.e. a tightening in policy. But there are reasons why you don't want to use these models in these kind of circumstances. But we see that in the US, letting inflation running wild is not really a medium-term solution, or is not palatable from a political point of view. High inflation rates are not what the public wants. It undermines the trust in the institutions. It's a political problem. So at some point, yeah, you have to bite the bullet, and even though it's painful, you have to tighten policy and potentially quite a bit.
Thank you very much, Dirk. I just want to briefly summarize our 1 hour and 20 minutes in half a minute. Dalia defined first of all what we are talking about. What is this German model, which is a model which is also pursued largely, somehow similarly, in the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria. Then she highlighted that it is basically now an amplifying of what COVID did to these type of models. So Russia's war, Putin's war, is stressing issues which arose during the COVID-19 pandemic. But all of you around this table were arguing that the capacity to adapt to those economies is significant, shouldn't be underestimated. And Jerome stressed the European background, which should be taken into account when reconceiving or when conducting this readjustment. Thank you very much for a very interesting webinar. I guess we should repeat this, and we should drill into some non-philosophical issues, possibly going forward more deeply. Very grateful for having had you. Thank you so much from the side of the Center for European Studies. And thanks to the audience also for tuning in. Have a nice evening here in Europe and a nice afternoon in the US.